Hello everyone, and welcome to CSS Level 2. In this section of the course, we're going to continue to expand our knowledge of CSS by learning about fonts and the box model. This will be a shorter section, but at the end we're going to have a project for you that actually covers and reviews the ideas from CSS Level 1 and CSS Level 2. Let's get started. I'll see you at the next lecture. Hello everyone, and welcome to Part 1 of CSS Level 2. In this lecture, we're going to be learning about font properties of CSS, such as size, weight, text alignment, etc. And then we're also going to learn how to download and change fonts. When dealing with fonts, we have to keep in mind that not every OS has every font. And if you've used both a Windows computer and a Mac computer or a Linux computer often, you'll notice that when you're actually trying to use a file that was created on Windows, on a Mac, or vice versa, sometimes the fonts have to change. And what we're going to be doing is exploring that relationship, because sometimes we may need to actually provide the font for our website because the default font isn't available on a certain OS. Because of this, we're going to be exploring a few links. The first set of links is about OS support for certain fonts, so that's operating system support, so what fonts does Windows support, what fonts do Mac support, etc. And then the second set of links is actually going to cover how to download fonts. We'll be exploring two websites, a Google font site and another site, to show you how you can download your own fonts from the internet or connect them using what's known as a CDN. Let's go ahead and start off just by showing some basic font properties with CSS in the editor, and then we'll hop over to the browser and check out how we can actually download fonts and check OS support for certain fonts. I'm going to hop to the editor now. Okay, so here I am at my editor, and I have two files open, a part1 fonts.css file and a part1 fonts.html file. And if you're looking for the completed version of these files, you can always check them out under the CSS Level 2 folder. Right now I have them blank, and we'll be coding through for this lecture. Let me collapse that directory, and you'll notice I also have my browser open and it's linked to my HTML file. What I first want to do is make some basic HTML. Hopefully by now you can actually do this quite quickly using Atom's built-in help. What I will do is add in a heading 1 here, H1, and we'll say this is something like heading 1, and then I'm going to add two paragraphs to this. First paragraph is just going to be lorem ipsum. Remember, that's that essentially filler Latin text, and luckily I can just begin to type LO, hit enter, and it automatically fills that in for me. And I will add in one more paragraph, but this paragraph is going to have an ID, so I can individually target it in the CSS file. We'll say ID is equal to 2, and then lorem ipsum. We'll save that, and let's refresh over here to make sure that's working. Great, we have heading 1, lorem ipsum, and then what I want to make sure I do is link my CSS file to my HTML file. Remember, that always happens in the head, so I will say link, and I can begin to type in link, hit enter here. The relationship is a style sheet, and the H reference is going to be whatever I call that style sheet. So in my case, it's called part1 underscore fonts. And as I mentioned previously in another lecture, it's a little unusual to have this sort of naming convention, especially with a digit inside the CSS file, but this is just so it matches up with the lecture notes. Okay, so everything looks good here. Let's explore some of the basics of fonts with CSS. So let's imagine that I actually want to change the font. Right now, it looks like it's in Times New Roman. That's essentially the default. If I want to change it to another font, maybe something like Arial, I can start typing font family. And that's going to allow me to then pass in a property of a different font. So we can see that there are some defaults here. These are very basic. So let's show you one of the defaults there. If I just say cursive, save this, and then refresh over here, I can see now I have some default cursive. It looks pretty ugly, but I can also pass in as a string, and that means that I'm wrapping it in either double quotes or single quotes, a font name that I'm familiar with. Maybe you've worked with a text editor before. Hopefully you're familiar with some font called Arial. So let me save that, refresh over here, and I can see now it's in Arial versus Times New Roman. All right, so that's the basics of a font family. But something we're going to have to keep in mind is not every font family is going to be defaulted on every OS. So certain fonts are really common between both OSs, such as Arial. It's in like 99% of Macs and 99% of Windows. But other font families, such as Helvetica, is really only existent on Macs, and maybe like less than 10% of Windows computers have that font. And we'll be discussing some websites that can help you choose fonts that will be available on both OSs, and later on we'll show you how to just download your own font so you can provide the font file yourself. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about font family. So as I mentioned, there are those basically default styles. So if I want something like monospace, I can do that as well for that paragraph. So let me refresh this here, and now I can see this is all done in monospace. Let's say I want to change the actual font size. Well, I can change the font size for everything in the body. And the way I do that is just say font-size, and here I can pass in pixels. So for instance, I can say I want it to be 10 pixels in size. Refresh over here, and I can see now it's in 10 pixels in size, 100 pixels in size, make it much larger. Now it's humongous. Okay, let's change it back to 10 pixels. Actually, let's do 20 pixels. And something to remember is I'm zoomed in here in my browser, so it may not look as large to you, so keep that in mind. Now, something you're probably wondering at this point in time is, well, what if I don't know the pixels I want for the font size? What if I actually want stuff to have a relationship between each other? So maybe I want the second paragraph to be twice as large as the basic font size on the page. How do we actually define that? And using pixels, as I've shown here, is actually not very common. What's more common is to use what are known as EM values. And EM values is a dynamic way of sizing things. So when you define the font size property, an EM is equal to the size of the font that applies to the parent of the element in question. And that basically means that if you haven't set the font size anywhere on the page, so let's say I delete this, and I haven't set the font size anywhere, so we can refresh here, that's the basic font size, then the browser default is often 16 pixels. So by default then, 1 EM, which would look like this, 1 EM, would be equal to 16 pixels. This is the default right here. Which means if I tell another tag to be 2EM, then it will be equal to 32 pixels, double that. And then you can get a relationship or a ratio for various tags in your HTML. What you'll usually do, however, is set a font size in the body element. So if we go back here, let's comment these out. Usually what you will end up doing is, for the body element, you will select a font size. And you will have it be some sort of default font size that you choose. You can do the 16 pixels, which is the same as the browser default where nothing's defined. But let's say font size is 20 pixels. And then from there on, for the other elements that you want to assign, you'll use EM, which is going to allow you to do a ratio of this, which is basically a ratio of the desired element pixel value divided by that parent element, which in this case is the body. So let's see just a quick example of this. I'm going to grab the number 2, remember that was the second paragraph, that's the ID, and state its font size is equal to 2.0 EM. Let's save that. We'll refresh over here, and now I can see that we have heading 1, the first paragraph, and now the second paragraph is twice as large in font size as the first one. So what you're doing here is you're stating some default body font size, and then from there, you can actually call the ID font size as a ratio of it. What you should avoid doing is trying to actually call something like H1 and make it mimic the font size of a paragraph, or vice versa. Try to make a paragraph as large and as bold enough so that it looks like an H1, a heading 1. That's really not the point of this. The point of this is that on your page, if you have two elements of the same type, but you want one to be a little larger, a little smaller than the other one, then you start calling EM. What you don't want to do is call EM to the point where you should have just called heading 1 or heading 2 since the very beginning. So keep that in mind. And then what I want to show you now is font styles and font weights, as well as text alignment. So if I call a paragraph here and say font style of paragraph, and let me change this font size again to 1.0, that way everything's the same. Okay, looks good. I'll say font style here is italic. So I can save this, and now when I refresh my page, I can see that everything is italicized. So you can call font styles for basic things in that manner. And you can also call things such as font weight, and that can be things such as bold, lighter, normal, 100, 200, etc. Not every font is going to have every possible font weight. It really depends on what font you download and what font you use, and we'll be talking about that in a future lecture. But we have font weight is bold, so let's save that and make this both italic and bold. And here I can see when I refresh, now they're in bold. Great. And finally, I want to talk about text properties. So if we see H1, one of the properties you're going to be using all the time is the text alignment property. And you can begin to write text, dash, and you'll see Adam trying to help you out with various text properties. We've already actually seen text decoration. Remember that was stuff like underline, overline, line through. What we want to do is talk about text align. And text align basically allows you to center something, justify it to the left, to the right, etc. So if I want to center heading 1, I just say text align center on that element. So I will save that, refresh my page over here, and I can see now heading 1 is aligned to be center. Great. Okay, we're going to be talking a lot more about alignments and how alignments work with mobile devices when we talk about Bootstrap. But for right now, what I want you to get out of this lecture is the following. That you can call font families, have some awareness of that some fonts don't work on every OS, and we'll be talking about that in the very next lecture as a continuation of this series. Then you can call font families for very basic things such as monospace or some of the other options if we take a look, or things such as cursive or serif or sans serif. We can save that as well. Then for font size, what I want you to make sure you get out of this lecture is that you can call a pixel, but what you should probably do is call an EM based off the default for the body. Then you can call font styles and font weights, as well as do text alignment. All right, thanks everyone. And in the next lecture, we're going to be continuing this part 1 discussion of fonts and talking about what fonts work with which OS, how you can figure that out, and how you can download your own font from the internet to use it for your website. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you at the next lecture. Hello everyone, and welcome back, where we're going to continue our discussion from last time of part 1 talking about fonts. In the last lecture, we showed some basic CSS properties for fonts. Now we're going to explore how to understand OS choice and font relationship. We will also show how to use custom web fonts. Let's get started by jumping to our browser and checking out a few links. All of these links are provided as comments in the Part 1 fonts HTML and CSS files that come with the download for this course. I'm going to hop to the browser now. Okay, so the first 2 links I want you to check out are the official Wikipedia links for the list of typefaces included with Microsoft Windows, and on the second link here with Mac OS. And here you can just scroll down and see the latest fonts added for Mac OS, and if you scroll further down, you can see the family names, subtypefaces available. So as I mentioned in the previous lecture, not every font is going to have every face or style available. Not every font can be shown as italic or bold. And here you can check out the Wikipedia links for more information on the faces available, that's that bold versus italic, etc., and the typefaces available. Now, if you're choosing a font and you want to know its availability on both platforms, you can check out this website called cssfontstack.com, and it has a really nice display of a font and then the percent of availability on Windows computers and Mac computers. So if we zoom in here for a second, we can see something like Arial is a font that is available on 99% of Windows and 98% of Mac computers. So it's a pretty safe choice for pretty much most operating systems that are using Windows or Mac, and that goes for Ubuntu as well. So there are other choices that may not be as safe. For instance, something like Optima is really only available on Mac computers at 94% and available only about 3% of Windows computers. So if you're trying to choose a default font, try to choose something that has high availability on both Mac and Windows. But let's say you're wanting to choose your own font. Well, you can actually download fonts from the internet, and you can either download the font file itself and link it to your project locally, which is what you'll do when you host everything, but you can also just link to an actual CDN or a link itself. So let me go ahead and explore how we can do that. There's 2 websites we're going to be exploring. One is fonts.google.com, which is a really great website to download fonts from, and the other one is fontlibrary.org, which kind of has a little bit of a goofier fonts, but it does have some pretty nice fonts as well. Let's explore how we can actually grab one of these fonts and put it into our website. So if you come to fonts.google.com, you're basically looking at a directory of a lot of font families. And you can clarify what kind of fonts you're looking for, maybe something like handwriting, monospace, trending, and maybe you're looking for a specific language, etc., number of styles, thickness. So let's look at one that's really obviously not a font that comes on your computer. So this one right here, Barrio, let's click on that. I'll click on the plus sign to add it. And here we see the family selected. So now if I click on that, I see this right here. And you'll notice that it says embed fonts. So to embed your selected fonts on a web page, copy this code into the head of your HTML document. And then it tells you what to specify in CSS. So you use the following CSS rules to specify these families, Barrio, and then you can also say cursive. So let me show you how we can do that. And you'll also notice that it has a load time of fast. So loading this using these links is going to take a little bit of time because your website's going to have to connect to Google. But you can also download the font itself. But let's try just with the embedding. So I will copy this link and jump to my text editor. And here I have the text editor open. And in the head of the HTML file, this is part 1 fonts from last time. I'm going to save this right here. And it's just a reference to, if I zoom out a little bit, to the actual link to fonts.google APIs. So right here, I've added a link, and now I can come over here, and let's say we want the paragraphs to actually have the font that we just downloaded. So let me delete some of the stuff from last time. In fact, we'll delete most of it, except for the paragraph, and we'll take care of font family, and we're going to copy and paste what is here, this font family line. So I will copy that, and then come back to the Atom text editor, and paste that right there. So let me save that. Here I have part 1 fonts. We can copy that full path by just coming here to the directory, copy full path, and now let's paste it into our browser. And here we can see that I have this sort of funky font from that Google API. So it's really easy to add in new fonts using googlefonts.api. And if you wanted to, you could also download the font and link to the file locally. We'll be talking a lot more about linking stuff locally versus linking stuff online when we talk about Bootstrap. But the main idea I want you to get out of this lecture is that you can come to Google Fonts, pick any font that looks good to you, add it to what is essentially almost like a shopping cart, and then check this out, and it will actually begin to add. So here, if I wanted to use 2 different types of families of fonts, you can see here that Google has automatically already added them to the link. So then I can get rid of Barrio, the first one, and then only have this Playfair display font. And it tells you what to specify in the CSS to actually specify those families. The other website I wanted to show you about fonts is not Google Fonts, but this fontlibrary.org, which is also another website that hosts open source fonts. And a key thing to remember is that some fonts can actually be really expensive and are not free. So not all fonts are free. You're going to have to make sure that you check the copyright and whether or not you have permission to use a font. On Google Fonts, all of these fonts are free and open source, so you can check them out. Same with fontlibrary.org, but on other websites, sometimes you have to pay to get access to a font. So make sure you keep that in mind. But let's just show you how to grab something from fontlibrary.org. Going to go check out a handwriting font, click on it over here. Let's choose this one that says Alex Brush, so I click on that one. Here I see the font, what it looks like, great. And then it says to use this font, it's very much the same thing we were doing. So I just copy this link, put it in the head of my HTML file. So let's get rid of the last one, paste that in there, save it, and then over on the CSS, I can see what I have to use. So we'll just copy and paste that, and it's showing right now for an example paragraph. So we'll come back up here and paste that whole thing in there. So now I'm just calling Alex Brush regular, save that, and let's come back up here and refresh this page. And we can see now I'm using that Alex Brush font. All right, hopefully you realize this is actually a pretty simple process, just linking to the head of your HTML document and then using the information in your CSS to basically use now any font you want. It doesn't have to actually be included on Windows or Macs. You'll be loading it directly from this website, Google Font or fontlibrary.org. All right, that's all I wanted to talk about for this lecture. If you have any questions, feel free to post them to the Q&A forums. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you at the next lecture. Hello everyone, and welcome back to part 2 of CSS Level 2. In this lecture, we're going to be discussing and learning about the CSS box model. The box model allows us to precisely dictate how we want HTML elements to look on a page. So the basic box model looks something like this. You have your HTML content. That may be something like a paragraph of text within your HTML. Then, in between the paragraph or whatever HTML content you have and the border, you have padding. And remember, the border is something we've actually played with before in CSS. That was things like a 2-pixel dotted orange border around your content. So if you want more space between your actual content and the border, you have padding there. And then if you want some space between your border and other HTML contents within their own box model, there's a margin you can specify beyond that border. So each of these padding, border, and margin elements have a space that you can define. That way, you can space out your elements exactly how you want them to look. And you can also specify each side. So just beyond padding, border, and margin, you can actually specify left, right, bottom, etc. to have even more flexibility and control over that box model and your HTML elements. Let's explore some examples of this by jumping to our editor in our browser. Okay, so here in my editor, I have an HTML file open called Part 2 Box Models. It's linked here in my browser, and then I also have it linked to a style sheet here that's blank right now. Let's add a little bit of content to this HTML file to get started. I'll add a heading 1 element, and it will just be saying something like top. And we'll give it the ID top. And then we'll add another heading 1, and we'll call it bottom. with the same ID bottom. So let's refresh this and see we have top and bottom. And now let's explore what happens when we adjust the box model around these. So remember, the box model consists of the margin, the border, the padding, and then the actual content. So to make it clear what's actually going on, let's come back to the CSS and then create a CSS call for each of them, for each of their IDs. So that's top and bottom. And we'll give each of them a border. So the border for the first one, let's have it be a 4-pixel solid blue border. And for the bottom one, we'll give it a border of 4-pixel solid red. So let's save that, refresh over here, and we can see now we have the actual borders around them. So something that we can actually specify is the width of the border itself, which we've experimented a little bit by actually calling in pixels. What we can do is define width as a percentage. So we can see right now that this blue border here goes from essentially one end of the browser to the other. And if I stretch this browser out as well, you'll see that the border continues to stretch along with me stretching the browser, which is good, but sometimes you don't want it to go from end to end. You actually want to define it based on some sort of percentage, and you can do just that. So if I want to define the width based off some percentage, I can say 25%. And now if I refresh this, I can see we're going to take up 25% of the width of the browser. So as I expand this, we can see we're expanding the blue browser as long as it takes up 25% of the width of the actual page itself. Now, let's show you another thing we can do. We've already seen text align, but let's go ahead and show that. If I say text align center and refresh this page, I can see now my text is aligned to the center relative to the actual border. Now let's imagine that I actually want to move this entire blue block around. Well, what do I have to change then? If we go back to our box model image, which I've opened up here in a new tab, we see that it's really the margin that's going to define the space between the border and everything else. So right now, if we come back here, I have the content, some border, and then the margin. And in between the content and the border is padding. But what we really want to change here is this margin right here. If I want to center this entire blue border. And one thing we can do is actually specify specifically margin. And then what I can say is the top, right, bottom, and left pixels. So we'll start off by showing you the pixels. What happens if we say something like this? 10 pixels on the top. And let me actually put this as a comment so you can remember the order. It goes top, right, bottom, left. The other way you could do this is by actually specifying something like margin dash left. So we saw earlier in an image that I can specifically specify left, right, top, bottom, but you can just do it all in one single margin call just by the spacing. And there's actually no comma that goes in between these, so we'll have the top be 10 pixels margin, right be 20 pixels, and let's say bottom is a lot. Let's make it 100 pixels, and left we'll make it 400 pixels or something, just so we can get an idea of the differences here. And if I refresh this, we can see here, now we're actually defining the margin based off of pixels, where the width is still defined to be 25% of the actual width of the page. Now if I call auto here to the margin, save this, and refresh, notice that it will be auto-centered. So if you want something to be centered, not just the text, but the actual block itself, that box model, we can see that we can call auto here. And right now I'm calling a width of 25% of the browser page, and the margin is auto, so that it's even on both sides. Great. Now let's mess around a little bit with this bottom call. Let's specify that width to be 50% of the page. And let's give it some padding. And remember, padding is going to make space between the actual content and the border itself. So keep in mind what you think is going to happen if I say something like padding 200 pixels here. What do you expect this shape to look like as far as the relationship between bottom and this red border? Well, let's find out. I'm going to refresh. And this is basically exactly what we hopefully expected. Remember, padding is the difference between the content itself and the border. So if we come back here, we see that we have the content, the padding, and then the border. So what do I do if I want to maybe align this to the center? Well, I just come back here and call text align center. Refresh, and I can see now my text alignment has been centered. Okay, so that is the basics of learning the box model for CSS. Really, we just want to focus on those four things: the actual content itself, the padding, the border, and then the margin. And remember the spacing that happens between all of them. And the fact that you can call top, left, right, or bottom for each of those things. Okay, coming up next is going to be an explanation of a project that will really help hone in on these ideas. I know we just really briefly covered it in this lecture, but the next project is really designed for you to kind of discover these things on your own. And then the next section will be discussing Bootstrap, which is going to help automate a lot of these things so you don't have to worry every time about adding a new element, what the border is, what the width is, what the margin is, etc. A lot of that stuff is going to be taken care of when we begin to use Bootstrap. But for now, we want to make sure that you understand if you had to go in and manually edit the CSS, that you're able to do that with the box model. So again, box model, main thing to get out is that if you need to adjust your content, you have the padding, border, and margin all to play around with to get stuff to look exactly like you want it to. And you can define things in percent or in pixel, and then you can align things to be auto as well. All right, thanks everyone. I'll see you at the next lecture where we're going to explain that project to you and how it's really going to help you understand the box model. And there's also a font aspect to it as well. Thanks, I'll see you at the next lecture. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Spectrum project, which is your final project for the CSS sections of the course. So for this project, you're going to be digitally recreating your own version of the art piece known as Spectrum 5 by an artist known as Ellsworth Kelly. And it's currently located at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, known as the Met. Let's take a look at what that art piece actually looks like. So it looks something like this, and what we're going to have you do is create your own little web page that has a very similar look to this. Basically, you'll be creating a set of table cells that have a color, and you're going to mess around with the border, the margins, and the padding, which we learned about the box model CSS, to space those table cells correctly so that it has some sort of appearance similar to this piece of art. So you're going to be creating, again, your own smaller version for the web page using what you've learned about the box model. And you're also going to learn how to pick a color palette to use based off a few websites that I'm going to show you now. Let's take a look at an example of what this project may look like and how to choose a color palette. I'm going to jump to my browser now. All right, so here I am at my browser, and I have a representation of what your final project may look like. It's going to be some sort of variation on this. And what we have here are essentially table cells. So here, each of these little blocks is a TD object inside of a table. And you'll notice that we were able to use the box model to add a little bit of spacing in between them, which is what you're going to do. And then we also notice that we have kind of a funky font here. So your project is going to be the following. You're going to choose a color palette. In a second, I'll show you the website for choosing a color palette. Then you're going to assign that color palette to some table cells on your web page. And then you're also going to choose a font, either use fontlibrary.org or Google Fonts. You're going to connect this heading, it can say whatever you want, to your new font, and you're going to connect the color palette you choose to these table cells and use the box model to kind of shape and stretch these so they look similar to the Spectrum 5 art piece. So as far as choosing your color palette, you can choose color palettes at this website, coolors.co, or coolers.co, or colors.co, depending how you want to pronounce it. Basically, it's colors with an extra o.co. And basically, this is just a color scheme generator. If you scroll down here, you'll notice that there's already tons of pre-made color schemes. So you can click on View All Palettes, and it will show you various palettes. So choose any palette here that you like. This is just on Explore, but you can click here on Best, wait for it to refresh, and it will show you the most popular color palettes that are chosen here. So for instance, this My New Palette is the one I chose for this Spectrum 5 piece. So you just come here, click on the palette, so click on View, and it will generate the palette for you. You don't need to watch the tutorial, just hit Exit here, and here we can see the hex codes for each of these colors. And those are the hex codes you're going to be using for your CSS file. So again, you just, in your HTML file, create the table cells needed to create something that looks like this. Again, this is just a table with one row and 5 table cells in it. And you'll also choose a font if Google Fonts, using the knowledge we learned about in CSS Level 2. So connect a font of your choice, then create the table, and connect it to some sort of palette by inserting these hex codes into your CSS. All right, so that's basically it. If you have any questions, feel free to post them to the Q&A forum. Again, you don't need to choose the exact same color palette or the exact same font, and your spacing and padding doesn't have to be exactly the same as mine here. Just get a general idea of how to incorporate color palettes from that online resource, fonts from Google Fonts, and the box model for spacing of these table cells. Those are the 3 main things I want you to get out of this project. Choosing a font of your choice, incorporating it into your website, choosing a color palette, being able to grab those hex codes and incorporate it into your coloring of your site, and using the box model to shape out these table cells. Okay, Thanks everyone, and I'll see you at the next lecture where we're going to code through an example solution. Again, not every solution to this is going to look the same, but just get the general idea. I'll see you at the next lecture. Hello everyone, and welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to be going over an example solution to the Spectrum project. Remember, your solution may not look exactly like mine as far as sizing and color choice, but the overall idea is hopefully similar enough that you can follow along with these solutions and reflect back on your own work. Let's jump to our editor and browser to get started. Okay, so here I am with my editor open. I have two files, project.css and project.html. They're empty right now. Here is what we're trying to recreate, something that looks similar to this with our own color palette choice and our own custom font choice. And right now I have this project.html. I just refreshed it so that it's clean and there's nothing there. Let's get started by working on the HTML. The first thing I'm going to do is just type HTML, and we'll call the title of this project. And we also want to make sure that it's linked to our actual style sheet. In our case, that's just called project.css, and that's all we have to pass since it's in the same directory. And then for the body itself, I'm going to give a heading 1, and we'll call it my Spectrum project. And then let's make a table. So we'll make a table. It's going to have one table row. And if we look back at what the solutions look like, remember, we have one table row with essentially 5 cells. So I'm going to call TD, and I will copy and paste that 4 more times so that my total is 5. And if I want to actually reference stuff here, it might be useful to give the table a class that I can reference later. So let's give it the class something like art. And for the table cells, let's give them each an individual ID. That way I can assign them each an individual color. And we may not use that class, but it's just there in case we need it later. The IDs we will definitely use though. So we'll give each of these their own ID. And we'll label this 5. So let's save that. Come back to project.html, refresh, and I see my Spectrum project, but the thing is, all my table cells are empty. So let's come to CSS and assign them overall something to make sure that stuff is working. So let's give them all a background color of black. And if I refresh this, I won't see much. I see essentially 5 little tiny cells there. You may not even see them on your screen. So what I have to do is expand the size of these. So let's continue doing that with something like giving these table cells a height. And let's give them a height of 200 pixels. Whoops, that should be a colon. Save that, refresh, and now I can see they're a good height. All right, the next thing I want to do is actually give these table cells a width as well. So let's do that. Let's give it something like 100 pixels. That should be fine. And then refresh over here. And now I can see my Spectrum project is starting to look similar to what I have here. And we can mess around with the size of the height and the width if we want to make it larger. So if we want to just expand this a little bit so it's a little nicer, there we go. And what I want to do also is start to grab that heading 1 and text align it to be center. Let's refresh this. And now we're getting to really think of something that looks like closer to the Spectrum project. Something else we notice here is that the table itself isn't centered. So let's try to use the margin on auto to do that. So I can use that class I used earlier, or I could also just call it table itself since it happens to be the only table there. And we'll just call auto, save that. And now I have a centered margin here. And remember, the margin is the outside, the very outside of the box model. So let's review what we've done. We've been able to create our table cells. We have the art class here, which allows us to just grab, if we go back to the HTML, that entire table. So I could have also just called table, but I want it to be a little more specific in case we have multiple tables here, and use margin auto to center it. And I've also text align center that heading 1. So everything looks good here. Now what I'm going to do is come to this coolers.co and actually grab some of these hex codes. I went ahead and just grabbed basically a random color palette, and I'm going to copy and paste these text codes. So let's copy each of these. So there's my first one. There's my second one. Third. Fourth, and let's grab the 5th one. And we have to make sure each of these starts with that hashtag. There we go. So those are my hex colors. And the way I can assign these is by calling the IDs. Remember, we gave each individual table cell an ID, and eventually we'll be able to get rid of this background color black. So let's do that. Let's go hashtag 1, and we'll call the background color for it to be this very first. Let's refresh this, and we can see we're beginning to override some of these TD colors, because if we remember about CSS specificity, the ID is going to be in the hierarchy or above the hierarchy of just a normal element call. So let's call background color again, and let's keep doing this for the rest of them. And if you want, you can basically fast forward through this because I'm just repeating myself here. So let's exit that, or copy that, excuse me. Semicolon, and we're going to do that 2 more times. For the 4 class, give it a background color. And let's do that again for 5 class. Or 5 ID, excuse me, I should have been saying ID, not class. And then let's paste in these colors here. Copy and paste that color there. Alright, so let me save that, refresh this, and now I can see my Spectrum project is looking pretty good. I have the colors lined up, and they're overriding this TD call. In fact, I can just delete that, save this, and it'll still look the same. Now I want to affect the spacing in between these. If we look at Spectrum 5, there's a little more spacing here in between these actual table cells. So to do that, what I can do is mess around with the box model. And remember, an important part of that box model is the actual border. So a quick way to do this would just be to give each table cell a white border. So I'll say something like border, and give them each, let's say, 6-pixel solid white border. Save that and refresh. And here we get the nice spacing out that I was looking for. And finally, I want to add my own custom font to the heading 1. So I already have Google Fonts opened here. I'm going to just scroll down to a random one. Let's say something this one looks nice, is Anton. So we'll add that. The family selected, we'll open it up here. I will copy this, put it as a link in my HTML file, save it, come to Project CSS and copy the font family call, and put it under H1. So now when I refresh project, I can see my Spectrum project now has that new font. And that's really all you had to do for this project. Again, hopefully you had enough practice with the box model so you can play around with this. You didn't have to do it with the border. You could have messed around with the margin and padding as well, but it's really up to you. There were multiple solutions to getting something to look like this. So do not worry if your solution did not follow mine exactly. There are multiple ways to get something that looks like this. If you have any questions, feel free to post them to the Q&A forums, but hopefully you had a fun time recreating something that you just saw the front end, and you could recreate it using HTML and CSS on the back end. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you at the next lecture.